versus fiction. My name is Savannah Shine. I'm the Ovarian Cancer Program Director at SHARE. We also have Stephanie Blaufarb, who's the Program Coordinator at SHARE. And before the presentation begins, I just want to tell you a little bit about SHARE. We are a 40-year-old nonprofit organization that helps people through breast or ovarian cancer, offering the support of those who've been there. SHARE offers many services, including helplines, a telephone and in-person support groups, educational programs just like this one. All services are free, and please do visit our website, www.sharecancersupport.org, for more information. A little bit about this presentation. All the participants will be muted during the presentation. When Courtney Hudson finishes speaking, we will open up for questions and answers. You're welcome to submit questions. You need to just look on the side of your GoToWebinar control panel. There is a questions arrow. If you click it down, you'll be able to submit a question. You can submit it anytime, starting now, throughout the presentation. When asking questions, though, please keep in mind that our presenters are unable to give specific medical advice around a specific, your specific situation. So try to keep your questions more general in nature and specifically about clinical trials as opposed to treatments or protocols. And if you do need any more support about those, please call the SHARE helpline, 844-ASK-SHARE, and you can get some information there. So the webinar is going to be recorded and will soon be available on the SHARE website. So please feel free to check the website in about a week, and it should be there if you know anybody that would like to be here but missed this presentation. I'd like to introduce our speaker. Courtney Hudson co-founded EmergingMed in January of 2000, and she's worked to launch 3 consecutive Medicaid-focused HMO startups on the East Coast. The creation of EmergingMed's patented clinical trial navigation services reflects Courtney's commitment to creating systemic solutions that coordinate access to care and empower patients and healthcare providers with unbiased information to make more informed decisions. And just so all of you know, on the SHARE website, we have partnered with EmergingMed to offer this same clinical trial navigation service that Courtney will be discussing today. Okay, so I'd like to introduce and thank Courtney Hudson for being here today.
Savannah, thank you very much for having me. It's my pleasure. The goal today is to make sure all of you are aware of both how to search for ovarian cancer clinical trials and to tell you a little bit about the landscape of what's going on in research and some, let's say, hidden facts or little-known secrets or twists on the topic that might be germane to how you will make decisions and how and when you will know that you want to search for clinical trials. So let's start with, as the agenda today, how to search for clinical trials, what's out there, about targeted therapies and tumor profiling in particular, considerations for phase 1 clinical trials. I think everybody should be aware of those, and then plenty of time for discussion and questions. As Savannah said, we're here to empower you with information so that you can find clinical trials that match your specific situation and that you can get access to those. And that's what our navigation service offered in conjunction with SHARE is here to do. A couple of things that I'd like to say right off the bat. One is that clinical trials may or may not ever be right for you, but we always hope you will search and understand what your options are. Fine that you may choose not to do it from our point of view, but we will work hard to make sure you know you have options at any moment in time. But speaking of timing, clinical trials are generally designed to enroll people who are about to start their next treatment or about to make a shift in their treatment, so that any time that you and your doctor are exploring the next thing you might want to try, that's the time to look for a clinical trial. The other thing you should always be aware of is that this is a service to help you search for clinical trials. A person is never required to enroll in a clinical trial, and you are never, and I mean never, required to stay enrolled in a clinical trial. And that is a right that all ethical clinical trials adhere to internationally. It is a commitment and the equivalent of an agreement everyone has made. So let's talk a little bit about the SHARE clinical trial matching service. It's been in place for a few years. We're thrilled to be working with SHARE. And technically, somebody can search both for ovarian cancer or breast cancer clinical trials, because obviously that's what SHARE supports. But today we're going to talk about the ovarian cancer clinical trial support. There are really 5 steps to a search for clinical trials. The link you see here is on the sharecancersupport.org website. It's called the Clinical Trial Matching Service. The first thing it's going to ask you to do if you want to find a clinical trial is to complete a profile, and then I will request and urge you to keep that up to date, because the trials you match 4 and match 2 are going to change as you move from therapy to therapy, and as you get scans and results, those are going to shift. We always want you on the phone with the clinical trial navigator. So as soon as you've completed a profile, or if you'd like to complete your profile for the first time over the phone, we strongly recommend that you fill out the form that basically requests a call from a clinical trial navigator on our staff. It's free, it's confidential. We want to make sure that you filled out that profile to give you the best and most accurate results for the clinical trial search at any moment in time. What that profile does is match your specific situation, your specific criteria, against every inclusion and exclusion criteria from every ovarian cancer clinical trial that is in the national database, or every trial that will accept an ovarian cancer patient, whether or not the trial was specifically designed for somebody with ovarian cancer. And just to give you a perspective here, there are over 5,000 cancer trials in the national database. 95 of them are targeting ovarian cancer specifically. There's probably another 600 or 700 that are early stage targeted therapy trials, many of them sometimes immunotherapy, that are fairly new, that will often accept an ovarian cancer patient, but it'll accept patients with really any kind of solid tumor, a lung cancer, a breast cancer, liver cancer, all sorts of different types. So there may be times when you want to look in both groups, but again, keep that profile up to date. The navigator will help you sort through those lists. You will need, if there's any clinical trial that looks interesting to you, we strongly recommend that you talk to the trial site. If you're a preliminary match, they would love to hear from you. They can tell you more and talk to you a little bit about some more details about the study and more criteria that it may have that we wouldn't know about. And help you figure out whether it really makes sense for you and for them to pursue and move forward with trying to get screened and enrolled for a trial. And then clearly, we always recommend that you talk about any clinical trial options you're considering with your doctor, but we certainly find 2 things are really common. One that is very helpful for you to find options and then share them with your doctor. You've got more time to look for your own options than your doctor or your healthcare team might. Second, while we encourage you to talk to your doctor and your healthcare team, you don't have to have their blessing or permission or any kind of referral to go ahead and consider a clinical trial and work with the trial site. But clearly, these are difficult decisions and complicated options. So we always recommend that you talk to the more people you talk to, the better. What's a clinical trial doing? Fundamentally, a clinical trial is measuring the care you get and how well it works. Excuse me for 1 second. Thank you. Sorry about that. So clinical trial, it's measuring. What's it measuring? It's measuring whether any new therapy or new combination of therapies is better or worse than what's out there today, better or worse than standard of care, and what's the risk or benefit profile of the therapy. Keep in mind that sometimes a clinical trial is a new drug or a new vaccine, a new immunotherapy or biological therapy, something like that. But sometimes it's a combination of 2 well-known drugs or therapies that haven't been tested officially in the past. And sometimes it's just a question of changing the dosage or the sequence of a existing therapy to see if it can work better. At the bottom of the page, you see a reference to a childhood leukemia. And the story here that I think everybody should hear is that using existing drugs over the course of about 30 years, from about 1970 to 2000 or so, roughly in that range, with the exact same drugs available, but changing the order in which they're given and the dosages, the timing, and the number of cycles, things like that, the survival rate for children with leukemia went from basically 10% to 80 to 90%, just by continually testing and trying to optimize use of the tools they had at hand. And I think that's something that really everybody should think about and be aware of. And it's certainly why we would encourage you to think about clinical trials, even clinical trials basically of standard of care, which you're planning to get anyway, to see if small adjustments of the timing can get you a better outcome, and therefore others a better outcome as well. There are phases of clinical trials. Phase 1 is the first time that a new agent makes its way into a clinical trial for humans, or the first time a combination is tried in patients. But there's something that's happening and very common now because of targeted therapies and the idea that researchers are better able to predict which patient populations a particular therapy should work on. They've started designing trials that automatically switch from a phase 1 into a phase 2 if it meets certain criteria. Likewise, there are trials now that are a phase 2 trial that might roll right into a phase 3, again, with some preset criteria met. And what that really, in both cases, would mean is the drug is not only safe for the group we're expecting and we expect to use it on and with, but the other thing it's telling you is that it's having some kind of anti-cancer effect, and that seems to be having an anti-cancer effect when you think it should. It's because people have a particular marker or an alteration that they were expecting. So these designs allow the sponsors of the trials and investigators to move forward and get more people enrolled in the trial if it's having good results. In the past, a phase 1 trial by itself, then a phase 2 trial, then a phase 3 trial, there was a gap in between. So you may know that there was a really good result from a trial, but it would take them time to then get the next study ready and approved. And you then could have easily a 6-month or 1-year gap between when you had good news and an interesting option that you might want to try and when you could actually get your hands on it and receive it in a clinical trial. The eligibility of a clinical trial is really determined the same way you and your doctor are going to explore any kind of therapy that you're going to get. It's going to be a combination of what diagnosis you have, what type of ovarian cancer you have specifically, what stage you're at, really, which means how far, where has it spread, and then your treatment history along the way. And then now genomic markers are getting much more common, and biomarkers and molecular profiling is getting more common as a basic, if not eligibility criteria, then at least something that's going to be tested and measured to help understand if a therapy is working for you. Is it because of a specific biomarker or genomic alteration that your tumor has? One would hope that that information would help you make decisions today, but it may be that it'll be a future decision that you would make, and maybe for a different population altogether, that your genomic information becomes helpful, because I think the testing is ahead of the drugs for genomic, specific for targeted therapies and precision medicine. The testing is way ahead of the availability and the testing of drugs that are meant and thought to target those particular biomarkers or genomic alterations or genomic profiles. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The other thing I'd like to say is understand that every clinical trial that you might consider, and certainly any clinical trial that we're going to match you to in the national database, has something built in, and that's called an interim analysis. It means when they get to the halfway point, they halt the trial briefly. They hand all the data so far over to an independent data review group. They call it a data monitoring board. And they look at the outcomes, and they look to see whether the results are so good that it would be unethical to keep running the study because the study is going to have a positive result, and you know that in fact the experimental therapy is working and it's better than the alternative. In which case they're going to unblind the study and tell everybody, and usually move everybody over onto that. But the second thing that can happen in an interim analysis is it will just confirm that the study needs to continue on and enroll all the patients it thought it needed at the very beginning when it was designed, to figure out and get the results, the statistically significant results, to show whether it is or is not better or worse than standard of care. The third situation is that in that interim analysis, the results are so negative that the control group is doing so much better than the group that is actually on the experimental therapy that they're going to halt the study because it would be unethical to keep giving patients something that they know is inferior, and therefore the trial is going to be a failure, and therefore that indication with that dosage and in that kind of configuration, it's not going to work. So understand that if you're in a clinical trial, you may want to ask whether you're kind of in the first half or the second half of it and hasn't had an interim analysis yet. But you should rest assured that if the trial was so overwhelmingly negative, it will be shut down and halted or significantly altered at that interim analysis point. So it's one of the many checks and balances built in, so that you're only being asked to be in a clinical trial if we really don't know the answer to the outcome and really don't know what the best thing is to do. Oops. Okay, so as of last night, there are about 50 phase 2 or phase 3 studies specifically seeking ovarian cancer patients. There's another 41 phase 1 trials specifically looking for ovarian cancer patients, and sometimes ovarian plus endometrial plus breast cancer patients, things like that. But so 95 total trials that are looking very specifically at folks like you. There are hundreds of general phase 1 trials that will take and accept any patient who has an advanced cancer, and generally an advanced solid tumor. So literally a tumor that grows as a mass that one can see on a scan. So there are, you may want to consider kind of looking at those in kind of different groups. But one would hope that there is a scientific reason for thinking that an ovarian cancer population would benefit from a particular therapy in these 95 trials. And this is a oversimplified but kind of a generic guideline that I want to share with you to think about how trials are designed. And what this is really intended to show you is that clinical trials are designed around standard of care and the standard kind of treatment pathways that you and your doctor will explore over time. And to overly simplify it, it goes something like this. You're diagnosed, maybe you suspect ovarian cancer because of scans, but there will be a surgery to either remove your cancer or probably to at least get a biopsy. And then after that, the standard of care is for almost everybody, unless there's some reason you can't have it, is some kind of platinum-based therapy, carboplatin, cisplatin, sometimes combined with something else. But that's the standard of care for everybody because so far it's the best thing that anybody's known to do. It's tested better than anything else so far in clinical trials. Remember that when you're at that first surgery or a biopsy, that's certainly an ideal time to send the tissue for biomarker testing and to bank that tissue so that it can be tested later on, if you like. Now, platinum-based therapy, if it works, you may, if there's completely no evidence of your cancer, then you're going to be considered something in remission or having stable disease. There is the center kind of option next here, which is second-line platinum sensitive, meaning if the first platinum-based therapy works for 6 months or more for you, either again removing signs of your ovarian cancer or keeping it stable or something close to that, then you're going to be considered a platinum-sensitive patient. And then if your cancer seems to be growing in less than 6 months of being on that first platinum-based therapy, then there's another set of decisions and options that will be made. And for each of these kind of steps in the journey, or each of these kind of steps in, let's just say, the clinical kind of treatment pathway that you and your doctor will discuss and explore over time. There are trials designed very specifically for these. I will also remind you, and it's important to know that clinical trials always expect that you've received standard of care. If you receive off-label care, you might make yourself ineligible for clinical trials because they're always looking to test kind of a therapy on the same group of patients who've had the same kind of previous treatments. So they can say, yes, this worked or this didn't work because of our treatment. And generally, there's a somewhat narrow window of time in which you can enroll. And we'll look at the next slide to let me give you a better sense of that timing as well. There are, as I mentioned a couple slides ago, 95 unique cancer trials specifically seeking ovarian cancer patients. And they are spread out throughout the whole treatment journey, if you will. So 13 trials exist for people that basically have not had surgery yet or are untreated. There are 4 trials, and you may have been able to have surgery but not treated. But again, if you're going to explore clinical trials, we would always recommend you do it from the moment you're diagnosed, just so you understand what's out there. I know it's a hard time to search, but that would be ideal. There are 4 trials that are called neoadjuvant trials. They are looking to try to help patients get a better outcome by doing something before surgery, which means you have to enroll before surgery. Now, sometimes that means they're going to take extra tissue and save it a certain way or store it a certain way, but you need to have signed up and consented and agreed to be in the study before you go in for surgery. Sometimes a neoadjuvant trial will want to give you some kind of treatment, maybe some chemotherapy or something different before you go into surgery, again, hoping that you'll have a better outcome. So we've got kind of an untreated 13 trials, 4 trials for that neoadjuvant situation where you have to enroll before surgery, 6 trials that would want to enroll you basically right after surgery, but before you started a platinum-based therapy. So again, a kind of a narrow window there. They would assume that you're going to need to recover from surgery, but they would want, and you should expect, that these adjuvant therapies are probably trying to improve upon the first-line platinum-based therapy that's out there. So 6 trials for that stage. Then if the platinum therapy seems to remove evidence of your cancer, there are 4 trials. If you're in remission, something close to no evidence of disease. There's 4 for that. If you are responding first time out to those platinum-based therapies, then and then after 6 months or more than 6 months, your cancer progresses. There are 52 trials in that situation, and if that second-line platinum-sensitive, second-line treatments for people who are sensitive to platinum in the first place, if those stop working, then there's 36 trials for basically being the next thing that you do, the third-line treatment. Let's go to the bottom of the screen. If you tried your first platinum-based therapy and it didn't work, that within 6 months your tumor started to grow, there are 57 trials available that would accept you and like to have you on their study. And again, if those, if you try one of those and it doesn't work, then there's again that 36 third-line trials, often for the same group. And some of these trials, so this is 95 trials total. Some of them will accept patients in different buckets along this journey, different steps along the way here. And that's why the count of these individual options at each step along the way, that count is more than 95. Okay, let's talk a little bit about targeted therapies, immunotherapies, and genomic profiling. The key behind genomic profiling or molecular biomarkers and finding those is figuring out what is it that's unique about your tumor? What's making your tumor grow? Why is it stopped? How did it lose the ability to die or be killed by your immune system, which is usually what happens when your cells and the DNA in your cells break. And as I mentioned before, sometimes this information can help you with your decisions today. Sometimes it can help you with your decisions tomorrow. One of the things that you may find, again, is if you get a test result and you've had a genomic profile done on your tumor, you might have results for which there's not yet a drug, but you can remain on the lookout in case a drug or a therapy or targeted agent becomes available. And that's where a service like ours wants to keep you up to date on trials that are available for you, including trials that in the future have a targeted agent that seems to make sense for you based on any testing you've had of your tumor. Some general things about clinical trials to keep in mind here. The world of targeted therapies and immunotherapies is accelerating the pace at which a drug's getting studied and, if it's successful, approved. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when I started EmergingMed, it was clearly taking 10 years at least to study a drug and get a decision by the FDA and the Food and Drug Administration, which is the organization of the government that reviews and approves new therapies and gives the makers of those drugs the ability and approval to market those drugs. Because you have ovarian cancer, you're in a unique situation for a couple of reasons. One is that somebody developing a drug wants to find an area in a group of patients to try it on that have the highest likelihood of it working. Sometimes that's designed by and determined by tumors that have been responsive to other treatments. I think, as you are all probably well aware, ovarian cancer can be pretty tough. And certainly there's not necessarily a cure yet. So there are, it may be the case that a developer may, for example, test out a new therapy in breast cancer because there are more breast cancer patients and more therapies that have worked in breast cancer than they found in ovarian cancer. Because there's more patients with breast cancer, there's a bigger market to sell the drug to or the therapy to if it gets approved. So I often encourage people with ovarian cancer to consider phase 1 trials or a phase 2 trial that will still accept, with patients with broad types of tumors. If you've got, any kind of, you and your doctor in particular have any kind of reason to think that there's a particular marker or type of therapy or modality that might make sense for you, because it's certainly the case that the only reason a compound is not being tested in ovarian cancer was just a business decision, not because the makers and the owners of it don't think it wouldn't stand a chance of working in ovarian cancer, but they just had to decide where to spend their money and where to start, and they may have started someplace else. So you're in a unique situation there, and again, that's where I believe targeted testing and targeted therapies can help you kind of narrow the list of where to focus. What I've provided here is just a list of the molecular targets that are explicitly being studied in the ovarian cancer studies today. So there's 95 studies that I referenced that are specifically asking for ovarian cancer patients. They are looking for these kinds of results, and these are going to be alterations or markers or translocations of genes or proteins on your cancer cells. So I want you to just have this as a reference. And then these are the 29 targeted immunotherapies that are being tested in, again, those 95 ovarian cancer studies as well. So I want you to, again, have this list. This list is probably, I'd say, there's a 40% turnover in this list from a time I presented a talk very similar to this one 10 months ago. So there is a lot of change. Things that have come off, things that have come back on, that are being tried again or switched out. So it's another reason we say keep your profile up to date and keep searching. Let's see what's new that's out there. So getting an update each month can be a pretty sensible thing to do if you've got the time and energy to do that. A couple things I want to point out about phase 1 trials, and then we're close to opening this up for questions in just a minute. When I started EmergingMed 15 years ago, only about 10% of any drug being tested in a phase 1 clinical trial ever made it into phase 2, let alone into phase 3. That rate has changed. Now 70% of the agents that are being tested in phase 1 trials for cancer patients are making their way into phase 2, which I think means, first, that there's a better selection process. They're putting better compounds into that pipeline. And second, it's targeted therapies as well. So they have a tighter scientific reason for thinking that a particular compound or therapy might work on a very specific subset of patients. So it's a statistic and just a concept that I want you to understand, because there's certainly lots of phase 1 trials can be tricky. They're certainly riskier than trials of compounds or therapies that are in later stages, as stage 2 or stage 3. But because of targeted therapies and because many of them are having early success, which means they're showing some kind of anti-cancer activity in the phase 1 trial, they are a place that you might want to look when, again, 10 or 15 years ago, I wouldn't have said that. I wouldn't have said that out loud. I've mentioned already there are hundreds, probably close to 600 or 700 of phase 1 trials that will accept an ovarian cancer patient, 45 phase 1 trials that very specifically want an ovarian cancer patient. We mentioned the rollover studies, where now you don't have to stop at the end of the study and then wait for a period of time to go into the next phase of the study, pre-planned. I would also say that if you're not interested in a phase 1 study, but you are interested in a particular therapy or compound that's being tested, one strategy to consider that I've heard in the past is go ahead and become a patient or get a second opinion at the site with the investigator who is conducting a phase 1 trial, because you know that company sponsoring the drug or the therapy and that investigator already have a contract and relationship, so you might find that it's easier to get your hands on and become a participant in a clinical trial of a particular therapy if you already know an investigator and are working with an investigator, just as a doctor or as a second opinion who has that compound and is working with it. One other thing I would say about phase 1 clinical trials, the first person on a phase 1 clinical trial is really going to be the first human to ever have taken or tried that therapy. That is very different than being the 100th patient. So when people say to me, I don't want to be a guinea pig, therefore I'm not going to look at a phase 1 trial, well, I can certainly appreciate that. And if you were the first patient in, you are the guinea pig. There are no two ways about it. But if you're the 30th patient in or the 100th patient in, particularly if you're 100th patient in and it's a rare type of cancer, that may be a lot of evidence, and they may well know the safety and the dosage of that new therapy. So it's another question to ask if you're considering a phase 1 trial at all. I think not all of them are created equal. The other thing I would say is, while the toxicities or the safety of a new therapy or your body's ability to metabolize it and the effect and whether it actually stays in your body long enough to do some good, that used to be really, and the dosage therefore, that used to be the only goal of a phase 1 trial. Now phase 1 trials are also in cancer looking for anti-cancer activity. Is it stopping or shrinking any tumors? So it's something that's changed. And I know if I just go and talk to my family about clinical trials, again, they will have kind of an old set of views about what's going on in research for cancer right now. I want you to have a more current or fresher look at what's going on there. Still lots of things to consider very seriously. And there's, by no means, there is risk to phase 1 trials or to any clinical trial, as there's risk as well to standard of care and other therapies that you might receive. So with that, let's open it up for questions. And I appreciate your time and hearing me out for the last half an hour. So thank you. What can I answer now?
Thank you, Courtney. We have some very good questions that were submitted, and the first one is, when is the best time for a woman diagnosed with ovarian cancer to consider participation in a clinical trial? You answered it, but maybe just to repeat it first. That's very important.
I can't say this one enough. The moment you're diagnosed, which is, I know there's a lot going on, and it's probably the last time you want to learn something, but there are trials for people who are just diagnosed, or a pathway that you may be on that you would want to have made a different decision had you known that there were trials for kind of early in the journey versus later. So we would always say, create a profile, find out what your options are. If you're at all interested in them, or you just want to know more and want to be certain, ask your doctor about them, or call the trial sites. You don't really need to understand them up front to just get that process started, because as you're learning about your diagnosis at the very beginning, And as you're exploring and discussing your treatment options, they will start to make sense because, again, a trial is going to be designed around standard of care. So the discussion within a couple of days will start to make a little more sense. So we would always say, explore at the very beginning, get that profile completed. Again, no pressure or need to go on a clinical trial, but we really encourage you to learn how they work and learn when you need to come back and when you need to update your profile. The other thing I would say is that if you complete that profile, you will understand how doctors are looking at your case, at your situation. Because the way you get evaluated for a clinical trial is sort of the same way your doctor is going to evaluate your status, your cancer, and what you might be eligible for. So if you understand that profile, you'll find, I think, that it helps you make sense of your discussions for any reason around your care and your treatment. Next question.
Thank you. Is immunotherapy being offered to ovarian cancer patients? Is it only for first-time treatment or for cancer recurrence?
Okay, so break this apart. Yes, immunotherapy is offered for ovarian cancer patients. It is only for recurrences right now, and that is I understand it, my staff understands it. It's primarily because a platinum-based therapy works for some people. It's the gold standard right now, and therefore is the first thing that anybody's going to try, that your physician's going to offer you, unless there's really a reason that can't or shouldn't happen. But for most patients, that's going to get tried first before anything else works its way in. There are right now about 10 trials for for an ovarian cancer recurrence. That are immunotherapy trials. And these trials generally fall into the category of checkpoint inhibitor trials. What they're trying to do is release the brakes on the immune system. For some reason, your ovarian cancer is the immune system's not doing what it usually does, is kind of attack the cell that's gone haywire, the cancer cell, and killing it. So releasing the brakes and getting that immune system going is what those checkpoint inhibitor therapies are trying to do. And when you see something that's an anti-PD-1 or an anti-PD-L1, those are examples of those checkpoint inhibitor therapies.
Great.
One other thing to that is the cancer recurrence. It's usually, or I think most often, being tried in not only patients for who have relapsed after the first line treatment, but also they probably were platinum resistant. That's much more common, or became platinum resistant at some point in time. So you do need to know your platinum sensitivity generally right now to be eligible for those studies.
Okay, thanks. Are there any trials aimed at creating remission? Anything similar to tamoxifen for ovarian cancer patients?
I'm not sure if there's anything kind of similar to tamoxifen with kind of an estrogen sensitivity take on it. So I would say ask your doctor about that. But there certainly are some trials that are aiming for remission and hoping with the goal of keeping somebody in remission. You need to look carefully at the time you would need to enroll, but at any moment in time, there's somewhere between 3 and 5 of these trials that will basically enroll somebody with no evidence of disease. And the goal is very much to keep somebody in that state.
So a more maintenance trial, or trial for a maintenance drug, possibly.
I won't try to categorize. I don't know. The answer is that I won't categorize how it's going to do it. But that is the goal of the trial, and there's a few of them. There's, I think on my slide there were, 4 on that graph. Yeah, the remission. So the no evidence of disease, kind of looking to keep you in remission. That's what the 4 trials are here.
Okay.
But those vary over time. Trials can come and go pretty fast.
Yeah. How can I participate in a clinical trial and not be part of the placebo group?
Okay, great question. That one certainly comes up often. So, first thing to note, a trial is almost always designed around standard of care, which means you'll get standard of care with or without the experimental therapy. In those trials, so if there is a treatment out there, nobody's going to design a clinical trial where you don't get a therapy that's known to work and have some known benefit to it. So what you'll see, I think, in most phase 2 or phase 3 trials is particularly phase 3 trials, you're going to see what you're offered is going to be standard of care with a placebo or standard of care with the experimental drug. And those in particular, I think, are interesting if you were going to do the standard of care anyway, and you might be interested in the experimental arm. In that case, the placebo really makes no difference. You will have the same treatment you were going to get otherwise. Rarely, and only if there is nothing known to work, would they test a new therapy in clinical trials versus a placebo. If that's the case, I would say look hard at it. Does it let you cross over? Because in some cases, a trial is designed where they are going to randomize people when there is nothing else that's known to work, which means everything else has been known to not work. They might try the new therapy versus a placebo, but you're going to get tested, week 3, week 6, 2 months in, something like that. And if your cancer has progressed, the question to ask is, will they let you cross over and get the experimental therapy? That happens often. I think the other thing, and the only other time really to look at a placebo in a trial, and again, they're not common, but the other time to look at it is if there really is nothing known to work, or you've exhausted anything that researchers and physicians have found to work, then is the experimental drug versus the placebo the thing to try. The earlier stage trials, phase 1 and phase 2 trials, rarely have that kind of randomization or have much less of it, so you're rarely going to get the placebo and something like that. But again, when you see that, I wouldn't shy away right off the bat. The next question is there crossover? Is there a way for me to get this compound, this therapy, the next right afterwards, right after it's been shown that the placebo arm, it turned out, didn't work for you. The other thing to ask in those situations is are the compounds being tested marketed drugs already? They may not have proven to work for your type of cancer, but are they approved to work somewhere else? Which means your doctor could give them to you in a situation that's kind of called off-label, if your insurance will pay for it. So you want to be careful. Again, a clinical trial wants to make sure you've had some standard of care. If you don't like a placebo in a trial, placebo arm, which again I would certainly understand what the options are and what could you do if you progressed, or if for some reason you thought you were on the placebo, what is the next thing you could do? The next thing may be a clinical trial, but the next thing might be a therapy that your doctor was going to try anyway. Just understand that you probably would want to consider the clinical trial first, not kind of an off-label therapy or something that they're testing out that hasn't been shown or proven to work yet. Sorry, kind of a wordy answer. Apologies for that.
No, that's helpful. So you sort of already answered this too, but just to be clear, would receiving chemotherapy make me ineligible for a future trial?
Probably not. In fact, I would assume that most trials for ovarian cancer patients will assume you've had chemotherapy or require it. And in particular, they're certainly going to expect you to have had a first-line platinum-based therapy, which is generally going to be cisplatin or carboplatin teamed up with something, with Taxol or gemcitabine or something like that. And again, I'm not a doctor, so I'm not sure exactly what those are called, but that combination is exactly expected. The reason to look for clinical trials before you start that is just in case there's one of those 6 adjuvant studies is a twist on that might be interesting for you, or might look interesting.
Great. If you're already enrolled in a clinical trial, is it still beneficial to get registered? I'm assuming they mean for EmergingMeds.
Yep, I would say absolutely, because depending on the therapy that you're getting as part of that clinical trial, you may or may not be eligible for more clinical trials. So I would say yes, and you also may find that there are things like studies that just want to follow how people do, having had certain therapies, that may come up. So we would always say yes, get registered, and stay up to date. One of the things that can happen, and I think what I'm guessing is the person is thinking who asked that question, even though a trial of, let's say, a drug X is going to use, let's say it's a novel new kind of mechanism of action, a new way of working. Somebody who makes another therapy that's being tested that's kind of in that same category, in that same drug class, you may not be allowed in there. And that may be something that's temporary. That may be something that, while today they would not let you in a second clinical trial for kind of that same category of drug, down the road they may change their mind on that. Or you might find that other trials come up where they expect you to have tried a drug in the class that you're on right now in the clinical trials, and they're still going to let you go on to something else. You don't know. It changes fast. And I think the other thing I would say here is that both immunotherapies and targeted therapies often are not expected to work alone. Sometimes they're expected to work kind of in conjunction with chemotherapy. The targeted therapy or the immunotherapy takes care of kind of one part of the reasons that your cancer is growing or not dying, and then the chemotherapy, with that door opened, can come in and whack, that would be the medical term for it, whack your cancer. So I would always say keep your profile up to date, because these are changing fast and the combinations are changing fast. And the more folks learn about the mechanism of action and who really benefits from each compound and each of the targeted therapies and each of the which patients, and specifically with the certain biomarkers or genomic alterations, this is going to mix and match fast. And it's working at lightning speed right now, which I think is both really exciting for all of you, but also makes it tougher to know what to do and how to make the next decision.
Since you mentioned immunotherapy, what does it? Oh, sorry, where did it go? What is the survival rate of patients receiving immunotherapy compared to those who undergo treatment with more traditional treatments?
Nobody knows. If we knew that answer, we would not need the clinical trials. That's exactly what the clinical trials are trying to establish.
Great. Does insurance cover clinical trials? If your health insurance does not cover costs associated with a clinical trial, can you negotiate with the hospital or researchers to get those costs covered?
Great question. So always talk through the money first, which I think all of you probably know. I'll state the obvious. The clinical trial will cover the extra things and the experimental things that are being added on because of the clinical trial. But they do expect that your basic insurance will cover the types of care you're going to get anyway. So, for example, if you were going to go on an adjuvant study, which is basically going to be some twist, some nuanced difference in a first-line platinum-based therapy, I would expect that trial to assume that your insurance is going to cover the basic kinds of things that you're going to get as part of the regular treatment, but the clinical trial has to cover extra tests, has to cover the experimental drug. Certainly would have to cover anything that they seem to happen as a result of that trial. But bottom line is every trial can be different and every situation can be different, and there's certainly times when the sponsor of the clinical trial will try to help out with the cost of care if that's the only way they can get you in the study, particularly if they're having a hard time filling the study because you're all a really rare group of patients. It's always worth asking about, but that is exactly the right question. The insurance should not need to cover the experimental part of clinical trials, but insurance should be willing to cover now the routine parts of care that you were going to get anyway.
Okay, great. Which also answers this next question about there being an out-of-pocket cost to the patient who participates in a clinical trial.
There's one other twist on that scenario, or one other thing to know is, particularly with cancer trials, the sponsors of trials and sites are not allowed to advertise and say, oh, we'll pay for this, we'll pay for that, because they don't want people making decisions about going on a cancer trial because travel costs are being covered, something like that. But you should always ask. If there's a trial you're interested in, ask that question. And every trial can be different, and every site, so every doctor that's opened and become an investigator for a particular trial might have a different answer. Generally, your travel costs can be reimbursed by a trial. That's certainly acceptable. You won't be paid to be in a cancer trial, but covering costs is something they are allowed to do. Not guaranteed they're going to, but ask, because there's certainly things that they can offset in there and help with. There's also a service like ours, and the site might also have information about ways to get assistance or help with housing or transportation costs as part of getting to and being in a clinical trial. So explore those, ask, always ask. But yes, those are great questions. So once you've sorted out clinically what looks like an interesting option for you, yes, dig into the financials, ask those up front, and I'm sure any hospital trial site is going to have some pretty detailed information about that.
Great. So again, the next question, what does a patient do if she's not near a hospital that's running a clinical trial? Can she get the treatments from her own doctor, or is she required to get to the hospital that's testing the drug?
So clinical trials don't have to be going on in a hospital. They can be going on in a doctor's office. But you do have to enroll. In fact, you're only enrolled in a clinical trial by a doctor who's signed up to be an investigator and trained to be an investigator on that study. And all the investigators on one study have agreed to give the same treatment in the same protocol and the same timing with the same testing, often using the same testing labs and places to do some of the evaluations. They all have to be the same. So unfortunately, rarely can you be in a situation where you can just take the experimental drug or protocol and have your hometown physician or oncologist implement that. You can, if you start on a clinical trial in one city that's not very convenient and a site for that same trial opens up closer to you, oftentimes they will make arrangements for you to shift so that you can switch to the closer investigator. But understand it's not just hospitals, but your suspicion is correct. You cannot bring, your own doctor can't just start giving you the treatments that are in a clinical trial.
Okay. This person has had the experience of using contact information about a trial, but the contact information is outdated or not good. Emails don't work. There's no return calls. Do you have any tips on actually getting to talk to someone about a trial if people are having a hard time reaching them?
Yes, work with our navigators, tell them you're having that problem, and our team, we actually have a whole data team that will run around behind the scenes and go find out what's happening and get you an answer so that you don't have to keep doing that. We generally would say, place your call, make your email, give a site about 3 days or so to respond, maybe 5. But if you don't hear back, tell us, and we'll run around behind the scenes and find out what's going on so you don't have to. And unfortunately, that happens a lot.
Which is a really great, just as an aside, service that we are so happy that we're able to provide to the people that are in our share community, because it's an extra, that navigator service is a really important aspect to sort of the patient versus the giant world of clinical trials. To have a navigator there is really helpful.
Absolutely. The other thing I would say, likewise, Savannah, the other thing I would say about that is, if you've got a question about what's happening in that process, or you think something just sounds strange about what you're hearing or what's being asked of you, talk to your navigator about it. Now, we've got lots of people we can go back and check on things with, and there are times when, sometimes patients just aren't familiar with how clinical trials work or certain pieces of them, and we can, provide some education around that and clarify. And other times, something could be happening that shouldn't be happening. For example, if you talk to 2 sites about the same trial, your preliminary match, let's say you live in New Jersey and there are sites in Philadelphia and New York City, and you're going to talk to both because you can in fact get to either place. Both are a 2 or 3 hour drive, and you could do that. If you talk to both sites and one tells you you're eligible and one tells you you're not eligible, that shouldn't happen. A trial is a trial is a trial, and it should have the same criteria and be enrolling patients in exactly the same way for the same reasons. So if you hear something that doesn't seem right to you, doesn't make sense, tell the navigator, and we can go dig around and find out what's going on. And we don't need to use your name or share your information to do that. We can confidentially go behind the scenes and talk to both sites and or trial sponsors and dig into some of those stories. Great.
So a kind of little bit of a nuance from what you've said before, and it sounds like there's some just clarification. Do I have to switch doctors to participate in a clinical trial, or can I continue to see my oncologist?
Great question. Keep your oncologist. Absolutely. That's your person. That is your guide through all of this. But when you're on a clinical trial and actually getting the clinical trial treatments and or therapies and tests, those will go through the investigator. But usually those investigators are happy to coordinate with your treating oncologist, your main oncologist and or team. So long as they're not disclosing things about the study results themselves, they're generally happy to coordinate on that front. So, but definitely you need the more people weighing in, the more people providing you, kind of education and guidance along the way. Absolutely. And keep in mind then too that, if you're on a clinical trial and you get, the flu and it's not deemed to be related to the clinical trial per se, kids brought it home from school, you're going to be back with your regular healthcare team. So it's a little bit of juggling for you, but yeah, keep both.
Okay, that's helpful. So what do you do, or what is done if tissue was not tested after surgery?
The tissue testing has to be ordered by a physician, maybe a pathologist. Generally, your tissue is stored at the hospital in the pathology department, usually in the basement, of the place where you had your surgery done. You should be able to request that it gets tested. Talk about costs for that so that you're not surprised. But I would very much talk to my doctor about getting tested.
Okay, very helpful. If a patient does not have a multi-gene profile, would some clinical trial investigators consider testing to determine if the patient's eligible for that trial?
Yes, many times that will happen.
Okay. Couple more questions as we're getting to the end. Through EmergingMeds, can I speak with other women with ovarian cancer who have participated in clinical trials? And I can help answer that too.
I was going to say, I would use share for that. Yeah, Savannah, we don't tend to do that. It's to protect people's privacy and confidentiality. But Savannah, what can share do there?
But yes, so that person could call the share helpline and speak with a peer. We can hook you up with a peer that you can speak with by phone who's been in a clinical trial. Whether it's a similar one, we can't guarantee, but we definitely have some very well-trained and great supportive peers that would be able to help you. So you could call the share helpline.
Great.
Okay, and do you know of any specific trials aimed at sort of like different kinds of cancer, for example, low-grade serous adenocarcinoma? How does somebody get that information?
We would know that if it's actually published in some of the trial listings. And as much detail as we have about the trial, we will put into the match criteria. So when you pick an ovarian cancer questionnaire and you go through that process on this clinical trial matching service, one of the questions it's going to ask you is, what kind of tumor do you have? Is it adenocarcinoma? Is it epithelial? What are the characteristics of it in that respect? And to the extent that the trials told us what they were looking for, we'll match you on that parameter. But we're not going to exclude you from any trial because you don't know or they don't know, or they didn't specify it. So usually you're going to have to talk to the trial site to dig in a little deeper if it's not already coded in the match results.
Right, but the point being, go into the EmergingMeds and they can, using those navigators, they can help you clarify which for different types.
Yeah, we can certainly help you rule out trials that obviously will not take the type of ovarian cancer you have, for example.
Okay.
I've got a relative now with carcinous sarcoma. So with that type, it's called out very clearly in some trials that they will not accept that type of ovarian cancer. So yeah, to the extent that we have any data to work with, we'll do that and help you through that list as best we can.
Okay, great. That is all the questions. I'd really like to thank you, Courtney, for a super informative program and for all of people that participated. This program, again, will be listed in the Share webinar library sometime in the next week. But very important, if all of you could when you close out your window, a survey is going to pop up. It's really important for us to know what you thought of this program and also for you to tell us what other kinds of programs you'd like to share. So if you could just give it a minute for the survey to download, and thank you again for all of your participation.